That was just a terrific presentation. She's agreed to share the charts with me so that I can take those back to Washington and read them again and internalize them even more. I think this is a really, really important issue that we've all come together to discuss today. And also a shout out to Michaela, who has been taking very good care of me throughout my visit. I did have a great visit yesterday as well, if I could just tell a quick story. I had the chance to spend some time with the Air Force ROTC, the Corps of Cadets here at Texas A&M. And although perhaps most people in the room know, but there might be a couple who don't realize that Texas A&M actually hosts the largest and oldest Air Force ROTC detachment in the country. Long history of producing very, very exceptional officers in all of the services. But for us in the United States Air Force, General Langell of the Air Force, who's now the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, is one of your graduates. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Wilson, is an Aggie. And so I had a great time yesterday with the cadets. We were talking about fish and zips and whoop, and I got it all out of my system. Gig 'em. All right, that's enough of that. But it was also fun to have dinner with you all last night. So today, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about some of what we're doing in the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, on the women, peace, and security agenda. And then I also want to broaden that a little bit by explaining a little bit about what we're doing in the Air Force today to be able to promote diversity and inclusion, and why that is an important topic for formerly General Welsh and me, and now why it is important for the new Chief of Staff, General Goldfein, and me. But before I begin, you heard the introduction. If I could just give a little bit more color about what it means to be the Secretary of the Air Force and just what exactly is my job in the defense establishment. So basically, it boils down to, as Secretary of the Air Force, it's my job, working very closely with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, to be able to provide the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States with military options that impact the air, space, as well as cyberspace. Those are the three domains that our United States Air Force operates in. And further, if you boil it down, it comes down to, as you heard, organizing, training, and equipping the Air Force, which basically means we take care of people, we work on people issues, we work on all of the ways that we get them ready to be able to do the missions of today when the President calls, and we're also always looking down the road to tomorrow. What are the technologies, what are the approaches that we need to take today in order to prepare our military for tomorrow? And so taking care of airmen, which, by the way, is a generic term. It's men, it's women, it's civilians. We're all considered airmen, the part-timers, the full-timers. It's a big part of the job. Now, also by way of background, we have 5 core missions, 5 things that we really do well in the Air Force. Those 5 things are what we call air and space superiority. So that means having control of the skies and also being able to leverage very important satellites and space assets for our best advantage. Then number 2 is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So that means we have to have a good view of what's going on in the air and space and on the ground, and that kind of knowledge is power. And then there's rapid global mobility. This is how do you get people and how do you get cargo quickly from point A to point B? And how do we keep those fighter aircraft and other aircraft aloft for long periods of time? Because frequently they do have to be aloft for long periods of time. And so we have refueling missions. And also, very importantly, aeromedical evacuation. These are all parts of rapid global mobility. And then there's global strike. So this is the nuclear enterprise, of which the United States Air Force is charged with 2 parts of the triad, the ground base, which is the intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as the air base, the bombers that are nuclear, as well as the precision attack platforms, which are not nuclear. So think of your fighter assets, think of your RPAs that can conduct precision strikes. And then the final core mission of the Air Force is how do we pull all that together, and that's called command and control. So how do we take enormous amounts of data, fuse it together, make judgments, make sense out of all that data, make decisions, and push the decisions out in a secure way to the people who need to know. That is what command and control is all about. As you've heard, we have about 660,000 people overall, so that's our full-timers, our part-timers, our uniformed, our civilian people. So you might think of me as the CEO of the Air Force. So there's civilian control of the military, and I am the top civilian for our Air Force, reporting into the Secretary of Defense, who of course reports into the President. And believe you me, we are busy, 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 precisely because we are globally engaged. So if I step back in the nearly 3 years that I have served as Secretary of the Air Force, it seems to me almost like the whole world has changed. The demands on the Air Force over this 3-year period has certainly grown a lot. And this is so because the world has so rapidly changed, more than any time, I think, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And those 5 core capabilities that I described to you that the Air Force brings to the table in any and all operations are more and more important in these operations. And when I'm talking operations, I'm talking about all-out war, all the way over to humanitarian assistance and everything in between. So for example, today our American airmen are participating in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So I'm sure everybody has read that China has taken coral reefs in the South China Sea. They've reclaimed sand from the ocean floor. They've essentially created some islands, and they have put airstrips and air traffic control, and in some cases surface-to-air missiles on these islands. So this is a form of militarizing parts of the South China Sea, which is a bad situation for the United States and very worrisome because an awful lot of the world's trade flows through those sea corridors. So we've got to make sure that freedom of navigation, both in the sea and in the air, is protected. We have also been extremely busy monitoring and doing our best to deter North Korea, who has been testing nuclear weapons, who has been testing delivery systems, so these ballistic missile launches you've been reading about, could one day perhaps threaten the United States if they can figure out how to put that nuclear weapon on that ballistic missile and have it travel for longer distances. So very worrisome development. We have been busy at work reassuring our allies in Europe in the face of Russian bullying, which has just gotten worse and worse since the invasion of Crimea. And of course, in the headlines quite a while has been now ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and strike missions that have been taking place in Iraq and Syria in the fight against ISIL. And then last, but certainly not least, we have been conducting a lot of humanitarian operations, both at home and abroad, when disaster strikes. So many of the same challenges that are driving the increased demands on the Air Force, things like terrorism, things like increasing levels of population insecurity that Valerie talked about, man-made and natural disasters, the growing number of failed and fragile states, all of these things, in my opinion, are making the women, peace, and security agenda more important, or it ought to be more important to policymakers going forward into the future. Institutionalizing a gender-sensitive approach to our work, promoting the recruitment and retention of women in our partner nations' security sectors, protecting women and girls from gender-based violence, and advancing activities that address the impact of conflict on women and children all have, again, my opinion, greater importance when the world is in a day like today, when we are seeing more refugees and more people at risk than any time I can remember, other than, say, World War II. So it's troubling times that we're working through, and I believe this WPS agenda needs to remain in place and needs to be strengthened. So you might say, all right, how are you doing right now today? And the bottom line, based on what I know of what we're doing in the Air Force and what we in the military are doing around the world, is not good enough, but we have made some progress. We have made some important progress, I would say. So under the leadership of President Obama at the top, and of course Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel at the beginning, and followed up by Secretary Ash Carter, I do think we have moved the ball forward on the WPS agenda. And as Valerie pointed out, I hope the new administration will continue the focus. So let me just give you a few examples of some things that I have seen personally in my travels over the last 3 years as I have served as Secretary of the Air Force. Last November, I was able to visit the headquarters of the U.S. Africa Command. We call it AFRICOM, that's DoD speak. And basically, that is the geographic combatant command with responsibility for protecting American interests in Africa and also building relations with African nations and regional organizations. So AFRICOM has a long-standing partnership with our European allies for training on WPS issues. So when I was there, they were getting ready for a workshop on women, peace, and security in peacekeeping operations, co-hosted with the UN, that brought together more than 60 participants from 17 countries. And AFRICOM has a small core of people, and they have a small budget to be able to advance this sort of agenda in their area of responsibility. And they're not alone, because they are joined by the Pacific Command and the Northern Command, and they're leading the way on training their people in WPS awareness. They host monthly briefings for incoming civilian and military staff on the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which of course is what kicked this focus off in the first place, the National Action Plan, and the ways in which WPS is being incorporated into their plans, exercises, and engagements. And then still thinking now about Pacific Command, last October I was out there and I got to visit the Daniel Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. It's in Hawaii. The DoD's regional, what that is, it's the DoD's Regional Security Studies Institute for the Indo-Asia Pacific region. So in addition to having a drop-dead gorgeous location, I knew I had to do a fact-finding mission as soon as I heard about this place. They're also doing some very good WPS work. So the Asia Pacific Center hosts visiting groups of senior military and government civilian officials from around the region for multi-week courses on subjects like security cooperation and crisis management. Their courses include WPS training with a focus on the practical steps that visiting students who, remember, are from that region, they come to this course, they get trained, but then when they go home, when they return to their host countries, they now have some additional tools and some additional ideas for inclusion of women in the security sector. And there is evidence that their work has produced some real results. While I was there, still my little visit, my bird's eye view, one Japanese student produced a report advocating opening women combat aviation roles in the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force to women. And in December, indeed, Japan did open its fighter pilot occupational field to women, and we think, at least, that that report had a very positive impact on that decision. And then finally, one more example. I visited Indonesia last August. I was there for bilateral meetings with senior defense officials. And through military exercises that the U.S. is conducting in places around the world, but we're on the topic of Indonesia, this one was called Gema Bakti and Pacific Agility. Our airmen are able to work closely with their counterparts, again, in this case, Indonesian counterparts, on gender issues, and this one was specifically for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. So in the combatant commanders around the world, I have seen true believers when it comes to this WPS agenda, and that's a good thing because they see it as a tool to help them get their mission accomplished. Because remember, part of their mission is to have engagements and to be an extension of the foreign policy of the United States around the world. And I think increasingly WPS is seen as a good way to help advance that ball. Now, as I mentioned before, rapid global mobility, which remember is getting large amounts of cargo and people to a target quickly, as well as being able to deliver life-saving aeromedical evacuation support. This is one of our core missions, and so we play an important role in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief efforts, wherever it may strike around the world, everywhere from Haiti after Hurricane Matthew to Nepal after the earthquake in Kathmandu, and scores of other locations around the world. So we took note when the DoD issued updated policy guidance that calls for the incorporation of WPS thinking into humanitarian assistance efforts, including considering the distinct needs of women and girls in crises and conflict disasters. So again, I offer these up as a few of the examples, things that we're currently doing across the Defense Department to implement the National Action Plan on WPS. It's something that we should all be proud of, and once again, I think you're right, Valerie, we need some advocates amongst the new team, because I certainly do hope that they will carry all of this forward. Now, within the Air Force itself, our biggest piece of implementing the National Action Plan is gender integration, which is a big part, but not the only part, of the diversity and inclusion initiatives that we have launched in recent years. Now, the Air Force needs diversity in our ranks, in my opinion, if we are to continue to succeed in the future against all the threats that we face. Now, why is that so? Because we, like every corporation in America, we are in a war for talent, and we need to be able to draw from the widest pool possible of the young people of America, and we need to be able to get into our ranks, and of course we are an all-volunteer force, so we have to attract people into our ranks, the best of the best, and that's one of the ways that we're going to remain the best Air Force on the planet. We also need increasing levels of innovation in our Air Force. And by the way, if the Army were here, the Army would say the same thing, and ditto for the Navy. This is what we all want. And innovation springs from innovative teams, and that means different people from different backgrounds, cultures, different ways of looking at and attacking and solving problems. This is the key to innovation. Now, there's an old saying, I forget who said it, but I've repeated it a lot of times, and I think it really is applicable in this case. If the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then pretty soon every single problem pretty much looks like a nail. And in our United States Air Force, we don't want just hammers and nails. We've got to be more agile than that and more innovative going into the future. So I've got a lot of issues on my plate, but I have come to learn one important thing throughout all of my professional experiences, and that is if you get the people part of the equation right in your organization, the other issues, which are also very important, are much more likely to follow. So I consequently spend quite a bit of my time working on people issues. And when it comes to how we are doing on our people issues, particularly our diversity statistics in the Air Force, I will tell you that we're pretty good when it comes to recruiting women, minorities, different types of people into the Air Force. So for example, we have the highest percentage of women of any of the military services. But in my opinion, we can do better on the recruitment side, and we absolutely have to do better as an imperative when it comes to the retention side. Because although we do a fair job today of recruiting different types of people, to include women, into the military, women in particular attrit at twice the rate of men when they get to the mid-career level. And if you want to know why there aren't more women at the top, that's a key reason why, because the pool starts to thin out considerably at mid-career level. It's not the only reason, but it's a key reason, because we just can't hire in a general out of the private sector. That's not the way it works. It takes decades to reach that level. And so we have to double down on not only recruitment, but also retention. Now, you might have heard that a big change to our policies regarding gender integration in recent years, and this, by the way, came after a DoD-wide Women in Service review, and it all came to fruition last December, was that Secretary Carter ordered that all roles across all the services would be opened to women henceforth, and of course, it was qualified women. The Air Force, by the way, had been completely supportive of these efforts from the very beginning. And prior to Secretary Carter's order, we, of course, did our own internal review. At that time, we had 6 career areas that were closed to women. So we already were the most open of all the services, but we did have 6 areas closed. They were all in the special operations field. But upon study and review, General Welsh and I recommended to the Secretary of Defense that we open those up. And indeed, that is what happened. Now, just because you open up these career fields to women doesn't mean that it's an easy deal to join, because it is not. These are hard jobs, and the standards for these jobs are very, very high. There's high standards from a physical standpoint as well as from a mental acuity standpoint. And it certainly is not, these are not jobs that are for any woman, and by the way, they're not for any men, just any men either. You have to be able to meet the standards, but now the standards are gender neutral. Another area where we've made some important progress is working to stamp out sexual assault and other forms of violence. Preventing gender-based violence is a core part of the WPS agenda, of course, and we think that starts at home. So we've had a variety of efforts, we'll never be done with this, to work on sexual assault, which, by the way, affects men and women. There are more men in the military. We actually have more survivors of sexual assault who are men than women. So it really affects all of us. So there's been a variety of attacks to this problem. I had the chance to talk to President Young about this yesterday, and of course that's a focus here at Texas A&M as well. And we're trying to now double down not only on taking care of survivors, but on preventing it from happening in the first place. And then finally, I will tell you that we have in the Air Force over the last several years launched two separate sets of initiatives to improve diversity and inclusion. So the first set of initiatives was launched about 1.5 years ago. General Welsh and I sent a message out to the entire force of here's why it's important to us, and here are some of the immediate steps that we're going to take to try to get a more diverse pool of applicants to come to us in the first place. Things that we're going to try to do to retain at the mid-career level. So the United States of America may not have paid maternity leave, but I guarantee you the United States Air Force does. So we offer now 12 weeks of paid maternity leave. That was doubled over the last year. It used to be 6 weeks. Now it's 12, and again, same for the Army, same for the Navy. So in this way, the military is leading the way. And there have been other initiatives as well that we have implemented on our own authority and some DoD-wide, where we're trying to become a bit more flexible so that there isn't quite the work-life balance issues that we have seen in the past. Keep in mind, we're the U.S. military, so when we gotta go, we gotta go. But if we can make flexible choices on the margin, we think that this will help us going forward. So I always say, again, that I have 3 priorities as Secretary of the Air Force, and the number 1 is taking care of people, because of course we rely on incredibly well-trained people and capable people to take us into the future. So if we keep the focus in this area, and if there's relentless follow-up to see what initiatives work, what ones don't, what more should we add going future, and we get the people part right, then I think matters of technology and other matters are much more likely to fall into place as we continue to advance the ball for our complex United States Air Force. The best news, I think, for the Women, Peace, and Security Initiative within DoD is because there has been some funding, there has been small teams of people, particularly for the combatant commanders around the world. I do believe they have become believers in this, just based on the data and based on the engagements that have occurred. But as Valerie said, this is all a bit now in question, and what will happen in the future. If you go back in time, yes, it started with the UN resolution, but then there was an executive order that President Obama issued, and from that flowed the National Action Plan, and from that there was some funding and some people within DoD. I'll just speak about my agency. If that were to be rescinded, or if it were simply left to atrophy, the focus would simply not be there. So my advice, you already said it and I'll foot stomp it, Valerie, is we need to look for champions within the new team who will believe, as I know you believe, and I suspect most of us in this room believe, that this is an important area and we need to keep the focus on.